Okay, so thank you for joining us at our virtual event tonight. My name is Derek Yonai, and I'm the director of the Koch Center for Leadership and Ethics at Emporia State University. Before we begin, I want to go over a couple logistics. The main one is if you have a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will do my best to get it worked into our question flow. So if you have any questions, feel free to type it in the Q&A box. And again, I'll do my best to work it into our question flow. Thank you for coming to our second live Q&A Governance, Law, and Economics event. The Governance, Law, and Economics lecture series is designed to highlight the three institutions that need to support and defend a free civil society. Those institutions are good governance, the rule of law, and market-based institutions. Tonight, we have Bryan Caplan with us. He's the author of the book, Open Borders, and he is a professor of economics at George Mason University. I've known Bryan for 20 years. I consider him a friend and a mentor, and I'm really glad to see him here with us tonight. Bryan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Derek. It is fantastic to be here. And let me say, I know a lot of you have probably been in bad Zoom meetings. So I'm going to do everything I possibly can to make it the opposite of those bad Zoom meetings. I'm going to keep energy high and try to actually let people talk. So let's do it.
So the first question I want to ask you is, you've written on all sorts of topics. You've written on voting, family size, the value of higher education. I'm curious, why open borders?
Right. Out of all the policy reforms that economists have advocated, when you really go and do anything like cost benefit analysis, this is actually comes out as the single biggest win that is known to mankind. Right. So, in a way, you might say, why did you spend time on all these other topics when open borders is looming there? And of course, a lot of it is you have a personal path and you get interested in some things rather than others. But once I started blogging, I had long been pro-immigration, but I just didn't understand how enormously strong the intellectual case was. And through blogging, I actually wound up just thinking about it more and then realizing I really need to do something about this. Then also saying, it's not that I still have so much something new to say as I have a whole lot of information that I want to put together and synthesize and bring before a larger audience. Because so often with academic research, even the very best papers languish in obscurity. They're in a journal no one's heard about. The people that would actually benefit from knowing it don't even know the journal exists, much less this particular publication. So I wanted to take the evidences out there and put it into an appealing package where you can see the big picture and see how all the research fits together. And that's why I wrote this book.
So I guess a question then would be, if it has such a large impact, why is it that it's been largely ignored then?
Yeah, so it's been largely ignored because, first of all, just goes against the nationalistic spirit of the world, which has been going on for well over 100 years. People just think very much in terms of, this is our nation, this is the way we're going to run things. It's very important for things to basically stay the same way that they've been here unto ages of ages. And again, the fact, of course, that many countries like the US have a tradition of having open borders or very high immigration doesn't really resonate because, well, that's like 100 years ago. I think another big part of it is just that most people are innumerate. They don't think in terms of numbers. They think in terms of sound bites. And again, there are so many negative sound bites about immigration in general and about open borders in particular, to the point when in modern American politics, open borders is an accusation. It's not a position that any normal public figure, any politician wants to embrace. Instead, it's something you say, you favor open borders. And then the accusing, no, I don't, I absolutely don't. Right. So again, I thought it would be great to have a book where at least someone would say, I do believe in this thing that so many people have been falsely accused of.
So we had a question come in, and it's, this is an election cycle, and they're curious, do you think there'll ever be a candidate who's in favor of open borders?
Well, so if you mean one of the leading candidates, that's different from will there ever be a candidate? Actually, there have been many candidates in recent decades that have advocated open borders, at least until recently. For example, the Libertarian Party platform advocated open borders. I think they may have fussed that up. Now in terms of major candidates, I say that once it becomes a popular idea, that will happen. So the real question is, will this ever be a popular idea? Honestly, I think that is a long shot. I think that there will be open borders in the next couple of centuries, but it will happen after most of the benefits have gone away. Because again, most of the benefits of open borders, as I explained in the book, comes from opening up borders between countries in very different levels of development. There are some gains from opening up the US and Canada, but the gains between opening up the US and Canada are nothing like the gains from opening up the US to Haiti. And why? Because the productivity of labor in Canada and the United States is quite similar. So when you open up the border, you don't unleash an incredible suppressed waterfall of human talent. On the other hand, when you open up a border between a country with very low productivity and one with high productivity, you do, because the hard fact is that most of the difference in productivity between countries is not a difference in the people. Haitians can do all kinds of jobs that are being done in America and would be much more productive here. It's that they are in a country where it is hard to produce things. In the same way, if you just drop most of our listeners in Haiti, what would they be able to accomplish in Haiti? It's just really hard to get stuff done there. And so, yeah, so, I mean, I think it will happen eventually, but, like it is an unpopular idea. I know this. Liberalization of immigration is, I think, a lot more realistic. So right now, public opinion in favor of allowing more immigrants is at an all-time measured high in the United States, which brings it up to about a third, right? And like, where was it before? Well, like 20 years ago and like 20, 40 years ago, it would have been single digits support for having more immigrants. So there's definitely a move in the direction of favoring more. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's unlikely that in my lifetime, there'll be major party candidates advocating it. And of course, even if they do, doesn't mean that they'll be able to get it or that they'll work hard for it. It's very standard for politicians to say they're going to do something and then not do it. So.
Okay. And we had another question come in that says, the person says they're generally in favor of open borders, but they're interested in what are some of the cons that would prevent open borders from taking place?
What are some of the causes?
The cons, the negative.
The cons. All right. So, I mean, again, what I would say is that what actually prevents things from happening isn't actual cons, it's perceived cons. Right. So the fact that something is good or bad doesn't mean it's going to happen. It's whether it is perceived to be good or bad. So in my book, I go over the perceived problems with open borders, and I say most of them are either just wrong or they're overstated. In terms of perceived problems, there's the idea that it's going to cause poverty of natives, and I say that's just wrong. The main thing that you get from open borders is a lot more production out of the same number of people, and someone's going to be enjoying that wealth. So it's a lot of those people will be natives. There's a big concern about immigrants being a burden on the welfare state, so they're going to use more services than they pay in taxes. And again, in the book, I say when you really look at the numbers, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Or at best, it's really exaggerated. Then there are cultural arguments, and again, I say cultural arguments really overstated. And then there's political arguments. I say those too. There's a little bit more to those where if you go and look at policy views of the foreign-born of the U.S. versus natives, you'll see the foreign-born are what we could say a little bit less pro-freedom overall. They're more socially conservative, more economically liberal, except in immigration where they are more pro-immigration or less anti-immigration. But in terms of like what are the very best arguments, the most intellectually sound ones, I mean, I say, in my mind, it's mostly comes down to, we can call the precautionary principle of just saying the society is really good by world and historic standards. I don't want to have any radical change at all because maybe something will go wrong and then we'll lose the society that seems really good, right? And I have to say, like if there's always a chance when there's a radical change that something goes really wrong, just allowing the internet. I have a bunch of friends who are worried about the Terminator scenario of the artificial intelligence turning on us and destroying mankind, and I can't say they're certainly wrong. Saying the only way to be really safe would be to not have computers. I will say I don't think it's reasonable to say let's not allow major changes just because we can't be totally sure that things will go wrong. As well, maybe the changes will also lead to really great things that otherwise we would have missed. Or maybe you'll need these changes in order to deal with other problems that were going to happen otherwise.
We have another question that came in, and they want to know, do you believe open borders are going to cause job market issues or have the possibility of creating a burden on society for those who seek governmental support for financial reasons?
Yeah, so in terms of job market issues, there's been a lot of research on this. And the main answer is in the very short run, maybe. So in the very short run, there is some evidence that when you get a lot of immigrants in a very short amount of time, then your unemployment rate temporarily goes up. Probably one of the best experiments here was Israel after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So you had an enormous number of former Soviet Jews going to Israel. And at first there was a spike in unemployment. In terms of long run effects, though, it's very hard to see that there's an effect on unemployment. And in terms of long run living standards, that looks very good because immigrants work. And when you work, you produce stuff, and that stuff's going to be consumed by other people. And again, most of those people will be natives. I mean, something that's very important to remember about modern economies is that something like 80% of the modern economy is services. So plumbers and electricians and people building houses and taking care of kids and restaurant meals. And the thing about services is they basically must be consumed by people that are next to you. So when a bunch of immigrants come and open restaurants, who will eat at those restaurants? Almost by definition, it has to be natives in the country. I mean, for things like manufacturing and agriculture, then maybe the gains actually go to people in yet another country. Where immigrants come here, this turns our strawberry industry into a giant boom. And then the strawberries mostly get exported to other places. And then maybe very few Americans might eat the extra strawberries. But for most of what's happening, it's services, and that really has to be consumed by natives. So again, it's always important to remember that there's the effect on you as a worker, there's the effect on you as a consumer, right? And again, as the economist Frederick Bastiat pointed out, if we only listen to producers in individual occupations, we basically never allow progress. If you only talk to doctors about whether it's good to have a vaccine that eliminates an illness, well, those illnesses are the way they make their money. So the vaccine costs $20. So why do doctors want to have vaccines? Right? Or if you were to go and talk to farmers, what do they want to happen to crops? It's like, yeah, I hope that there's a great pestilence which cuts the food supply by 90%, sending the price of food into the stratosphere. All right. So that's what is in the interest of people in individual occupations. However, when you think about it that way, you realize, yes, but this is being paid for by the rest of society. And then what is the best way of thinking about it? I say in the book, as I tell all my students, the secret of mass consumption is mass production. If stuff is getting produced, it's being consumed by a human. And so anything that increases the total production of humanity is raising the living standards of humanity. And again, since most of the stuff that gets produced in a country gets consumed in that country due to the services being the main sector anyway, then you can say that this effect on the standard of living of natives is very good. In terms of the tax effects or the welfare state, this is the question that cannot be answered without doing math. You've got to do math. You've got to go, and you can't just say, well, seems like they're using a lot. It's like, well, all right, let's go and take a look at the taxes that immigrants pay, not just the first year they show up. You want to look at the tax they're paying over their entire lifetimes. You want to go and look at the benefits that they're going to be consuming. If an immigrant is young, you don't want to go and say he's not consuming any benefits. Eventually he'll be old and he'll collect pensions, right? And then you say, well, what about their kids? We got to factor them in. All right, so the kids are going to school, and even the kid's native born, that's really caused by the immigration. But then eventually the kid will be older and he'll work. Anyway, there are some nice, reliable, boring quants who have done this arduous task of crunching the numbers of immigration. In my book, I rely very heavily on the National Academy of Sciences estimates. So I don't think you can criticize the prestige of the people doing the work. And again, their numbers say that not only is the typical immigrant to the U.S. A net benefit to native taxpayers, but furthermore, even low-skilled immigrants are a net positive as long as they come when they're young. So old, low-skilled and low-skilled migrants do seem to be a net burden, but all the other demographics seem to be a net positive.
We have a couple questions that are all interrelated, so I'm just going to sort of bang these out pretty quickly. The first is, some students want to know, what are the hurdles to actually coming into the United States or being allowed to migrate here?
Yeah, so basically the default is absolutely not, no way, go to hell. So that's the default. And then if in order to overcome that default, there are a few ways that are generally extremely hard, right? So there's a modest number of skill-based visas, right? Surprisingly low, actually. I think that might be like 20% of the US quota. Then there is a much larger amount for family reunification, right? And again, here there are different degrees of family. So if you are a child under the age of 16 and you have a parent who is a citizen, then basically there's no limit on those. So they jump the queue, right? So if you are a child of a citizen, then you get here. Spouse of a citizen, again, you basically jump the queue, not quite as good as a kid, but close. And then it just goes down from there. So if you're an adult child of a citizen, then it's going to be harder. If you're a parent of a citizen, going to be harder. If you are a sibling, harder still. right? So, and again, the ease actually depends upon how many migrants that your country's already sent in. So if you want to get a sibling in from Mexico, then maybe a 20-year wait if you're lucky. All right, so that's another group. Then there is a system for refugees, right? Which is not that small of a number. I mean, it's pretty comparable to skill-based migration. But again, for them, basically, there is the task. First of all, you've just got to get in the queue in the first place. So you got to get in the queue in the first place, which is hard enough. And then if you do, then you've got to convince people that you really have, that things are going to be very bad for you back in your home country. And here again, like a lot of it depends upon how lenient the judge is. So there are judges who basically say no to everybody, darn close, and then there are other ones that might let in 1 in 4, right? So a lot of it's quite arbitrary, with the really just according to the luck of the draw there. And then finally, there's also a lottery. The U.S. is a strange country that has an immigration lottery, and this is one again. It's called the diversity lottery, and basically, if you're a would-be immigrant from a country that sends very few immigrants here, then you have a pretty good chance of winning the lottery. If you're from a country that sends a lot, you have 0. You're just not eligible, and then there's people in between. Basically, if you want to get in from Iceland with the lottery, you got a pretty good chance because it's they don't send a lot of people in the first place, very low population, so you're doing okay there. And then there's a few other categories. There's immigrant of extraordinary talent. So this is sort of like the Einstein visa. So there's that, and there's a few other ways. But basically, the U.S. system, family unification first, and then you've got similar numbers for high skilled and for refugees. But again, like none of these routes are really reliable. Oh yeah, also since Derek and I are professors, there is a giant loophole for professors. So research professors can almost always get in, although their spouses often will be denied permission to work. So that does deter a lot of them from coming probably. But anyway, that's something where whenever people say, oh, well, sure, you think that, Bryan, Derek thinks this because you don't have anything to worry about. It's like, what do you mean we have nothing to worry about? We're in pretty much the least protected occupation in the country. Like whatever harm immigrants are going to do to us has occurred.
So this also follows up with a question that we had come in about why is it so difficult to get asylum then? And is obtaining asylum meant to be that rigorous and complex?
Yeah, when the whole system is designed to make it really hard. So first of all, there's a quota of about 200,000. So this is the maximum that can be let in. And then in order to go and even get in the queue, it's tough. So, you might have to actually basically, you would go and send in your application from another country, but if it's the kind of country you need asylum from, then good luck with that, right? And, and then, of course, there's the ones that get here and then try to get asylum. So, but again, the system is basically premised on you are lying, you're faking, you're fine, prove that you'll be murdered, right? And again, if you think about it, well, obviously, if you're starving your home country, you see this would if you're starving, this would be considered an economic migrant, not asylum, not refugee. You can't just say I will starve to death unless I come, let me in. That's not good enough. It's got to be that there's going to be some humans that will do evil things to you, not merely that the crops failed and you're going to die, right? And but yeah, it's set up to make it very difficult. In the same way that think about this. Never mind immigration. Just to come to the U.S. as a tourist is impossible for most people on Earth, because the U.S. government's instructions is to assume that anyone who gets in as a tourist will never go back. And then if you want a tourist visa, you have to convince the U.S. government that you will go back. And if you're from Guatemala, how would you even do that? It's like, well, yeah, sure, I'd be making 5 times as much money in the U.S., but I definitely would not want to stay because, and then you might say, well, because I actually have a fantastic job in Guatemala, or because I've got a big family with kids that I'm leaving behind, but no, not good enough. Or maybe you show that you've got $1 million house in Guatemala. It's like, all right, maybe with your $1 million house, that case, perhaps. So, but again, the system is just premised on the idea that people will want to stay when they come. And again, this is not a crazy idea when you realize how much gain immigrants get from coming. The key point of my book is that this gain that they're getting is a reflection of the gain that they contribute to the world by coming. In the same way that the pay that you get is a sign that you're contributing to society, the pay that you get from migrating is a sign of how much more you can contribute to the world if you're working in the first world than if you're stuck in the third world.
Okay, shifting gears a little bit, we have a question coming in asking, it seems like a lot of the discussion about open borders using economics is from the self-interested perspective of the country receiving the
Mhm.
immigrants. And the person wants to know, to what extent do the interest and well-being of the potential immigrants count as well?
Yes. So when policy analysts think about immigration, they almost only think about native populations. Again, like I said, most people are very nationalistic. Even people who don't think of themselves that way really are. There's the famous incident at the beginning of World War I where there's all the international German socialists saying working men have no country. And then the Kaiser asked them to go and vote for war credits. And virtually all of them say, yeah, yeah, all right, Krieg. All right, so that's like really human nature. Human beings are very nationalistic. Let's see. So let's see. Sorry. Wait. I got derailed. So what was the yeah.
So I guess the question is, as economists, we talk a lot about
Oh yeah,
production.
yes, of course. Sorry. All right, yeah, but yes, in terms of the effects on immigrants, there I would say that virtually every fair-minded person, and again, that doesn't mean people who agree with me. Fair-minded just means someone who will just calm down and look at numbers. Says obviously immigrants gain astronomically. All right, so just the gain in earnings for immigrants from poor countries can easily be tenfold, right, or more. So, yeah, so like a standard estimate, like typical Nigerian who arrives in the U.S. multiplies his income 16 times. So, and of course, this doesn't just mean they get more money. This means they got money to send home to their families. Really mean it can mean the difference between life and death for their families back home. So there is that. Now, people sometimes do worry about what about the effects on the population that stays behind. Part of that, I say, is that under open borders, you could just bring the family and then you wouldn't need to worry about it. But even under the current regime, the key thing is that migrants send home so much remittances that it really is a big gain to people that stay behind. So I say, like, out of economists that study brain drain, the most really, even the very pessimistic people say is it could become a problem, but there's no sign of it yet. And what I say is most of the reason why you have this brain drain or like most skilled workers leaving is because they can leave, right? Whereas low skilled workers, unless they got close blood relatives in the US, it's hopeless for them to get in.
So it's a positive sum game, not in a negative sum game that some people would think.
Yeah. Of course. Like the main thing to think about is when you move someone from a poor country to a rich country, their productivity increases enormously. This is really obvious in, say, agriculture. You move Mexican farmers from primitive subsistence farms in Mexico, put them into US agribusiness, and suddenly they're growing 10 times as much food. And it's no mystery as to how that's possible, right? Or manufacturing. You go and see people doing like home manufacturing, low productivity, and then you move them to the US in a modern factory, and suddenly they're producing 100 times as much stuff. Even for services, though, the key the point about services is that you shouldn't think about services being a physical good. You should really think about it as the time you save the consumer of the service. So a Haitian could probably shine just as many shoes in Haiti as he could in Miami. But in Miami, he is saving the time of people who have much higher earnings, and therefore the Haitian is contributing much more to the world. The same way, if you save Bill Gates 5 minutes of his time, you contribute much more to the world than you can than if you save 5 minutes of my time, because Bill Gates' time is vastly more valuable than my time. Valuable not just to him, but valuable to humanity. Right. So for all these reasons, really the point of immigration restrictions at the end is just to trap human talent in places where it can't accomplish very much. And again, of course, there are economists who say, well, maybe it's just that the workers in poor countries are less skilled. This is decisively disproven, right? We can really basically do the experiment where we move people and see overnight their wages and productivity skyrocket. It's just easy to show. So yeah, like the gains to migrants are very large, and it's because immigration enriches humanity, not just the receiving country, not just the immigrant. It enriches humanity overall.
Speaking of trapped, we have a question from one of our retired faculty members at ESU. And in a nutshell, his concern is that usually when we have free migration of labor, it's usually at very low what he considers to be substandard income levels. So
Mm-hmm.
you're basically making very low wages at poverty levels.
Mm-hmm.
And his concern is that as we just have this open door of more migrants coming in, you're perpetuating these low wage individuals. And he wants to know, is there a keyhole solution to open borders that will address the low wages that migrant employees are paid?
Right. So the main thing to understand about the low wages is that people don't come because they want low wages. They come because they want better wages and they're getting them. So when you go and take a look at countries where people talk about how horribly immigrant workers get treated, most notably the Gulf monarchies, if you actually look at what's going on, is it that people come from Pakistan and they show up in Kuwait and like, oh my God, this is much worse than back home in Pakistan where things were wonderful, and now they took my passport and I can't go home. That is not a statistically normal story, even remotely. Those migrants, they got cell phones, they're talking to people back home, and what are they telling them when they get a job in Kuwait? Are they saying don't come, it's terrible? No, they're saying it isn't perfect, but you know what else isn't perfect? Pakistan. It is fantastic compared to Pakistan. It is totally normal that someone from Pakistan can go work in a Gulf monarchy in conditions that most of the people listening would consider terrible, and yet they are making 5 times what they are making in Pakistan. They might be working as a janitor in Kuwait, and when they go home in 10 years, they are the richest man in the village. And this is very important to keep in mind, because when all you do is look at people right here doing a job that you wouldn't want to do, it's so easy just to say like this is terrible, this isn't working out for them. And that is an emotional reaction that we must do everything we can to crush. Don't react emotionally and say, I wouldn't want to do it, therefore it's bad for that person. Totally wrong. You always need to calm down and say, compared to what would have been happening to them without this job, and realize the reason migrants come is because it is a huge improvement for them. Now, if this still isn't good enough for you, what could you do instead? Well, you could, of course, go and give migrants lower tax rates, or actually give them a wage subsidy. You could have the earned income tax credits for low wage migrants. I would not push any of these things though, because I want to get people to say yes. I say that the difference between being allowed to migrate and not being allowed to migrate is night and day. And then the difference between being able to get the earned income tax credit versus not, that's a marginal difference. And if there's anything about giving migrants money makes them more reluctant to have migrants in, and I think it does, then don't do anything that makes people nervous. You've got to reassure natives, make them feel really comfortable. This is not a burden. They are people who are here to work, to be productive, right? And I will note, when people look down on the Gulf monarchies and their poor treatment of migrants, there's one obvious measure by which they treat migrants wonderfully well, and this is they let them come. Kuwait is about 85% foreign born. So before you say, oh, Kuwait, they're so bad to migrants, they let them in. So why is the country feel so freaking superior? Because the few they allow in make good wages, but they hardly let anybody in. What good is that?
So I guess a great follow-up question would be, is there a good example of an open border country that would be a positive exemplar?
Yeah, so the easiest one is, of course, the United States before 1921. So we are coming up to our 100th anniversary of ending open borders. Of course, it wasn't perfectly open borders. There were a few restrictions on Japanese and Chinese migrants, and on anarchists and prostitutes, and like a few different categories that were not allowed in the old days. But uh, there was a period of a couple hundred years of virtual open borders into the United States. And then the same actually goes for a number of other migrant societies. So Canada was similar. So Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, these are all countries that had a long period where they're trying to get as many people in as they can, right? So now you may say that's 100 years ago. Who cares about that anymore? In that case, I would say, well, then we have to go and look at the Gulf monarchies, which are the most extremely open countries. They're not perfectly open, but 85% foreign born. They are letting in a lot of people. Right. And then you might also go and look at the European Union, where they have a big open borders region within there. And again, worth pointing out, these are not all rich countries. So difference in income between say, like France and Romania is not so different between the U.S. and Mexico. And yet Romanians are free to move into France and work there. So you've got that.
I know I'm going to ask you to do something impossible, but in about a minute.
Yeah.
You have a chapter in the book about the moral arguments. So how would you
Yes.
convince somebody who's not moved by economics or gross world product? What would be the ethical argument for why open borders make sense?
Yeah. So I would just start by saying that telling someone that they are not allowed to live and work anywhere other than Haiti seems like a very cruel thing to do to someone. So, like, if you were born in Haiti, how would you feel if someone said, tough luck, you're a Haitian citizen, unless some other country is willing to let you in? Ha ha. Look, fat chance of that. Then you have to live out the rest of your life in Haiti. So then the question is, this seems like a really bad thing. If it seems like such a bad thing to do to someone, why would you do it? So I just say the start is just what's the moral presumption? Should the moral presumption be you're stuck in whatever country you're born, or that countries have to come up with some really good reason to say no to you? So I say it should be, since this is a terrible thing to do to another human being, there should be a good reason to say no. It's not impossible to come up with a reason. Like if there is a horrible plague in Haiti, and if you let one person in, it will cause ruin to the rest of the world. Then you very well might say, I know this seems unfair, but we're saving millions of lives by keeping you there. Sorry. But most of the arguments that people have against immigration are nothing like that. They are flimsy, paranoid arguments. And again, this is why I say that the social science does matter, because it really comes down to, are the reasons that people are offering to overcome this moral presumption of yes, good? Like, do these arguments hold water? Are they at all plausible? And then when you realize how much gain there really is, I'd say the moral argument is very strong indeed. Now, again, there is this argument people sometimes say, look, this is our country, and it belongs to us. We get to decide what to do. I would say, like, if you really believe this, then what intrusion of government would not be justified? So is it okay for Saudi Arabia to say, this is our country, this is a Wahhabi country, there's no freedom of religion here any more than there's freedom of religion to open a church inside of somebody's house? Like, does it make sense to think of a country as being like somebody's house, where the people who are there have sovereign right to decide everything that happens there? And I say no. The country is not like a house. It is one where there's a bunch of individual people in their individual houses, and they should be able to do what they want in their own property and mind their own business about what's happening in other people's houses. So that's my answer to that general objection.
Okay. It's amazing how quickly a half hour goes. Bryan, thank you for joining us. I'm sorry if I wasn't able to hit all of the questions that were asked, but I'll tell you what, if you send me an email, I'll make sure I forward it up, and hopefully we'll be able to get your question answered offline. Thank you for joining us tonight with our virtual Q&A session. At this odd time in the world, our mission right now is trying to provide engaging content while at the same time trying to avoid Zoom fatigue, because let's be honest, I think we're all experiencing that at some point. What we would love is for you to contact us and let us know what you think about this virtual setup that we've done, where we've had a recording and then a live Q&A, because we're working on what our pivot strategy is for next semester, and we would love to get your feedback as we begin to plan out what our slate in the spring looks like. You can always follow us on Facebook at Koch Center ESU. You can also find our archived GLE lectures on our YouTube channel. And if you're interested, you can follow us on your podcast platform and listen to the podcast versions of our GLE lectures. Again, thank you for your time. Thank you for coming. And we hope you stay well, stay safe, and please be good to each other. Have a good night.
Okay, and thanks everybody for your time, and hope you did not zoom out. Thanks a lot.